Hello, and welcome to the Oregon-California Trails Association podcast. If you're just tuning in, thank you so much for joining us. This podcast covers the stories of marginalized identities along the Overland Trails that are often undertold and underrepresented. Our goal is to bring these stories to light and show how diverse and multicultural American history has always been. Black American history is, I think, one of the most shamefully undertaught subjects in this country. When you think about how Black American history is unavoidably intertwined with nearly every aspect of American history as a whole, it makes even less sense why our schools seem to barely focus on it. When it comes to being left out of the narrative of American history, Black Americans are too often the victim of these historical omissions. For example, when learning about the Oregon and California trails, I was never taught that Black immigrants traveled to the West as well. My history textbooks failed to mention how, for many Black Americans, the journey to Oregon or California was likely to be much harder than for white immigrants, and yet, many still chose to make that journey because of the potential freedom and life-changing opportunities it offered to them. That story, the story of a journey west for freedom, is sorely undertold. Luckily, recently there have been more and more historians willing to do the research and find the voices to share these stories. Our guest this episode is Dr. Shirley Moore. Moore is Professor Emerita at California State University, Sacramento, where she specialized in U.S. and African American history. She received her PhD from the University of California, Berkeley in 1989. Dr. Moore's book, Sweet Freedom's Plains, African Americans on the Overland Trails, 1841 to 1869, caught my attention as I was researching the Black immigrant experience, and she graciously agreed to join our podcast for a discussion about her writing process and how she was able to take what were often second or third-hand sources and still find a way to let the original voices shine through.
When I was fresh out of high school and starting college at UCLA, I thought I wanted to do something like sociology, but I had some really good history teachers that really, persuaded me otherwise that history was the place I needed to be. I think I've always been fascinated by history, and that's what I pursued. Now, and I taught at the Cal State Sacramento for almost 27 years till my retirement in 2015. I taught U.S. history with a specialization in African American and Western history. And at some point, and I think it was around 2008 or 9, I was contacted by the National Park Service because they were interested in updating their interpretive materials regarding the Overland Trails, and they became acquainted with my work in history, African American history and Western history, and asked me if I'd be interested in doing a report for them regarding African Americans on the Overland Trails. And that's a subject that I hadn't tackled or really thought of before, but it sounded fascinating. So I jumped right in and started doing the report. And I finished the report for them, and I realized that there was so much more involved in this story of Black men and women and children on the Overland Trails that I knew that it was worthy of a book. And so that's when I really began to dig into it. And but that's the genesis really of my interest in the Overland the Overland Trails and African Americans on the Overland Trails and their experiences.
Because I feel like for a long time and still to this day, a lot of the stories we tell are kind of skewed. They're a little, they're whitewashed. They don't really go into how diverse these trails really were. Um, and I think a lot of that, I don't know, the misrepresentation comes from inability to tell these stories the way that they actually occurred. And I'm wondering how your process was of gathering this information and then weaving it into a story. You do a wonderful job of sharing the stories of all these individuals that you talk about. And I'm curious about your process.
Well, let me back up and say one of the problems with really getting at the Black people who made that overland trek was that in many of the sources that historians of the trails rely on, they were really overlooked, undercounted, and just not referred to by name or any kind of personal identification. So if they were mentioned at all in those sources, they were mentioned in passing. Although, for some of their experiences and stories were there for the picking, but just went untouched. And so there needed to be a lot of digging. And I was determined to, contrary to how that history has been approached in the past, I was determined to try to get as closely as possible to the motivations and experiences of those Black men and women from their point of view as much as I could. Now, a lot of the materials that exist that deal with Black overlanders come from the diaries, journals, observations, reports of whites. So you have to, there's a layer, and sometimes a lot of times you have to read between the lines. But I wanted to try to get as closely to the Black overlanders' experiences, what they thought about the trip, what they thought about what motivated them for going, and really make them as closely as possible human beings with their own dreams, their own aspirations, motivations, and reasons. Black overlanders and white overlanders shared sometimes similar reasons for going, making the trip. But what white overlanders could not and did not experience was the slavery and the racism, discrimination, and violence that hemmed even the so-called free Blacks in. So that was motivation their white counterparts didn't have. And that therein lies really, I think, the heart of the story. The title of the book, Sweet Freedom's Plains, for example, comes from an abolitionist hymn. It was a popular hymn at the time called the Flying Slave. And one of the lyrics, I'm going to try to quote it as closely as possible. Behind I left the whips and chains, before me lay sweet freedom's plains. And so there's a motivation that compelled those Black people who trekked overland that their white counterparts did not and could not have. And there's a backstory about how I discovered that, and I thought, well, that's the title of the book. It was about 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. I was still working, and my husband, my late husband, Joe Moore, was thumbing through Delilah Beasley. She had a wonderful volume published in 1919. She was a self-taught historian living in the Bay Area, and she chronicled the lives of many of the Black pioneers who settled early on in California. And my husband came across this this section where she has this poem and reprinted in her book, her 1919 book, Negro Trailblazers of California. And he read it to me. And that's, and this is 2 a.m. We're all blurry-eyed, but I said, you found the title for my book. So that's the little story. And it was quite interesting.
That's
To
so
find it that way.
fantastic. That's such a wonderful little moment that went into the creation
Yes.
of this book.
Those little moments seem to happen all the time as I was writing this book. Sometimes I would think, okay, well, I've done this, and I'm done, and need to close it up. But some of the stories would sort of pop into my frame of view, and I thought, well, I've got to explore this. So several of them are like that.
The stories that you share in your book are so important, and I feel like it's the kind of thing that should be taught to children when they're learning about the development of the United States. And if you had a say in kind of putting together or recommending some materials for curriculum for public schooling, are there any specific stories or things that you think should be included?
I grew up in a little town called San Bernardino. It was little then, not so little now, kind of like a suburb now of Los Angeles. And I didn't know, and was never taught, that there was a sizable community of Black Mormons, most of them enslaved. But one of the probably most well-known people to come out of that area and era was a woman who made part of the trek of Mormons from Mississippi to Nebraska and then out west and then on to California, was a woman called Bridget Biddy Mason. And she's probably, as I say, the most well-known of the people there. She was responsible for a landmark case that freed her and her family and the other Black Mormon. So there are, and I always start off when I talk about the book and the history it covers. Some people, I think, don't know. Most people don't know that the most iconic emblem of the Overland trek, it was the wagon, right? The covered wagon, and most people don't know that a Black man who never set foot on the trail, his name was Hiram Young, was the most sought after and prolific maker of wagons. They said one of his contemporaries said that you could see a Hiram Young wagon on the trails from the jumping off points along the Missouri River to California and beyond. As he was so popular, he was a facilitator of that movement, and his name is not well known. He features prominently in my work, and he never set foot on the trails. So even with the most iconic symbol of Western migration, African Americans were integrally involved, and Hiram Young certainly facilitated that. Some of the other stories, I think people don't know. I know most people don't know how important a role African Americans played in facilitating the success of many of those wagon companies. They worked every inch of the way. Worked their way across along with their white counterparts, but they, as one of the people recording the journey noted, many who were enslaved were worked longer, harder, and did the most onerous work, and had some of the skills that helped whole companies survive. And this was at a time where wagon companies had exclusive express terms in their charters that no Blacks would be allowed to be part of the company. not even if they had the money to pay, or not even if they were willing to work their way across. So I think that's something that is left out of history. Just the foundational contributions that African Americans made to the Overland Trail trek, the westward expansion to westward migration. Blacks were in every position, every step of the way with their white counterparts, and did so under the severest conditions, and with no legal or other protections to speak of.
I feel like we're working with, every other puzzle piece. And there's so much that's missing that would be able to give
Exactly.
us just the larger picture about
Exactly.
everybody who's involved. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
But it takes a whole lot more digging, though, a whole lot more digging. And that's one thing I discovered, that, there are probably documents and journals and diaries of Black overlanders, is sort of moldering away in people's personal, letters and effects in the basements of Black homes across the country, everywhere. But it takes a lot of digging to unearth those things. And sometimes you can find some information in the strangest places. I got an account of an eyewitness, Clara Brown, who was a former slave, and she settled in Colorado. And really, there's a long story to her. If you read the book, you know her story. She's sometimes called the Angel of the Rockies. And she would lead wagon trains financed out of her own pocket, because she was a very successful businesswoman in Colorado, wagon trains across of former slaves to settle them in the West. And I found an eyewitness account of one of her wagon trains from in the strangest place. It was a health report, I think around 1961, from the public health, the state of Colorado. But buried in sort of the minutia of that report was an eyewitness account of a young Black girl and her mother, who were also gearing up to make their way across the plains, and caught up with one of Clara Brown's wagon trains. And she describes it. Probably, well, I can't say the best, but it was quite an experience to encounter that, buried away in that report. People have to be aware of the importance of these kinds of things. If you think, well, they're of no consequence, no importance, and skip over that, then that call will never go out. Once you realize that these people were important, integral parts of this movement, then you are motivated to make that call, to search, to dig through the boxes and the bins and the photographs, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like it starts with how we teach young people in this country about the history, because if you're made to feel like people like you or your ancestors, if depending on how long your family's been here, if you're made to feel like you were not influential or you're of no consequence to the development of the country, you're not going to think to look. Which is also why I feel like it's so important to share stories about people of color in early America, because they've been here this whole time. I mean, when you talk about the indigenous people, they really have been here this whole time. But I feel like a lot of people don't realize how diverse the trails were. Because of how it's depicted.
And they'd be surprised, and I think that's been one of the reactions to my work on the trails, especially this book, Sweet Freedom's Plains, that people, I had no idea. We didn't know about the diversity, because in popular culture and in the popular imagination, we haven't seen that. We haven't heard that.
Right. It's always just the, white cowboys.
Yeah, it's kind of, the cowboy story, the quote, pioneering, quote,
Mm-hmm.
movement. But it's much more than that, much
Mm-hmm.
more than that. But it's part of our story as Americans. It's American history. And to leave that piece out just leaves a gaping hole, as you say, in the puzzle
Mm-hmm.
of our history. And so I wanted to, that's what I wanted to explore. And I think you mentioned earlier, I often say that, there are stories galore, experiences galore that I've uncovered and put in this book, that Hollywood could make endless feature-length films. They don't have to go to fiction or anything like that. There are enough there are enough stories and people and all sorts of actors, in this drama, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
that would make compelling films and so on. And you don't even have to fictionalize it up. So,
Right. I mean, I hope that we start seeing more of this kind of history represented in media. I feel like
yeah,
we're slowly getting there.
yeah, I think we are, and I think it takes more and more historians to really recognize the importance
Mhm.
of the experiences of these people, and not from the point of view of outsiders trying to interpret their experiences, but let as closely as we can make it, let their voices be heard, their voices be
Mhm.
heard. But let them tell us what motivated them, what they hoped to achieve, what they wanted to do, what they experienced. Let them tell us. And I I think that that was one of the things I wanted to do with this book.
Yeah, that's that's so important. I really love how you put that. Because I think, yeah, a lot of even what little representation we do have of people of color on the trails or in early American history is usually from the perspective of, um, usually a white person, but somebody outside of that culture looking in,
Right,
even
exactly.
even with the best intentions. Yeah.
Absolutely. For many African Americans, whether they were enslaved or free, those Black overlanders, whether enslaved or free, it struck me as I was doing this work that they believed that the first steps out on the trails, even when they were provisioning themselves at the jumping off points along, the Missouri River and other places, they believed that the minute they set foot out on the trails, their lives would be dramatically changed and different for the better. I write about the journey becoming journey to independence for free Blacks and for enslaved Blacks. A slave who was identified only as Lee and Mr. Thompson's Negro boy was emboldened enough to openly declare his intentions shortly after setting off with his master to California in 1850. A white who was traveling with that party in the wagon wrote in a letter that the slave named Lee was, quote, heard to say that he would not work for white men much longer, end quote. And the whites in the party were so upset by the Lee, the slave's attitude, that the letter writer said that that slave, quote, got too big for his britches, and as soon as he got out of state. And so they were alarmed by Lee's audacity, and they sold him, so they would no longer be troubled with that kind of uppityness from this slave who, the minute he set foot out on the road, and he was still enslaved under his master's control, but he said, this won't be happening for too much longer. And
Wow.
yeah, isn't that, it's just wonderful. And that's as close as I could get to a slave's own word,
Mm-hmm.
an overlander who was enslaved, his own words about why he was going. And so I have a number of those kinds of stories.
It's just remarkable. And I think also a testament to I think your way of writing and your way of collecting these stories and sharing them is really fantastic, because you really found a way to, like you were saying, let them speak for themselves, even if you were only
Yeah.
going through secondhand accounts.
Yes.
And I
Yeah.
think that's a testament to you as a writer and as a historian.
Well, it caught my eye, and I thought, I can't find any other words. And let's see, and they say sometimes you have to read between the lines when other
Mm-hmm.
people are reporting. At other times, they lay it out pretty clearly. One of the first ones of that type that I found, white overlander was traveling in the gold rush era, to the gold fields, and he encountered a Louisiana slave woman on the road to California with her owner in 1849. And he's recording this in his diary. She confided to him her hopes. This is the white immigrant's name is Joseph Warren Wood, telling him that she was not free, but she, quote, soon would be if she served her master well on the road to California, and 2 or 3 years after she got there. She was willing to trudge on, envisioning a day when, she said to him, I shall return and claim my children that they may be free too, end quote. We could hear her voice, right? And
Yeah,
hear her
exactly.
motivation. Yeah, and they're not, of course, not all of the people who went west on the Overland Trails were slaves. They were free and were leaving to try to escape Black laws and Black codes and anti-Black violence that plagued free Blacks in this country, South, North, East, and West, as it turned out. But one of my favorite stories is about a mother and daughter, two free Black women who were traveling west. They'd hired themselves on to work in a military wagon train, and another white diarist was traveling nearby and came across very distressed daughter of the team, just out in the middle of nowhere, it seemed. They were working women heading west, um, trying to make their way, mother and daughter, and they were kicked out and left, on their own to fend for themselves. And this white journalist, white immigrant, finds the daughter. She said that her mother had talked sassy to the major, who was the head of the wagon train. And she said that her mother told him she was just as free as he was, and she wasn't used to that or would not put up with that. And they summarily were kicked out of the wagon train. Fortunately, they were taken in by the other man's train, and she said that they had left them there with all their belongings thrown on a heap around them. The army wagon train went on, leaving the mother and daughter without provision, to the mercy either of Californians or the, quote, savages. And that's how he wrote that in his diary. This is a man by the name of Eccleston who's recording this. But
Mm-hmm.
this is kind of fraught with, the gender dimension. African American women were also at the prey of whites, and Eccleston seems to be, as I say in the book, really moved as much by the young woman's looks as by her plight. I say this is a direct quote. He wrote in his diary, quote, her features were not African in the least. She was neatly dressed, her low neck dress showing a breast which in form would eclipse many a belle whose might have been whiter. Her waist was small and exquisite. Her color was a shade darker than a mulatta. And but for the prejudice of color, she would be a charmer, end quote. Conversely, he wrote, the old dame, that is, her mother, was different, being darker and bearing all the marks of the African race, end quote. And she said, Eccleston continues to write that one of his trail mates, quote, offered to take one, but they would not separate, end quote. So reading between the lines, there's something going on here that put the younger woman and her mother at risk. And so that was a real problem for Black women on the roads, on the trail. But that's one of my, and this is one of those stories that this was mentioned in Rudolph Lapp's a volume, really, really wonderful volume called Blacks in the Gold Rush Era. And it was mentioned in passing and just barely mentioned in a footnote. And I thought, well, that's interesting. But so I said, I was almost done at that point with the book. But, I was telling my husband, it's like these women were knocking on my, on my desk saying, listen, if you're going to tell the story about the Overland trip, we need to be in this. And so I said, well, let me get Eccleston's diary and see what this was about. And then, I think in Lapp's book and maybe in some other books that talk about the Overland journey, they might mention this in passing, but they don't go into the detail. And so when I read the details of this, what I just read to you, that fleshed it out, I thought, wow, this is quite a story.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that.
I'm so happy to share this material and this work with your audience and anyone listening. And I just want to put out the plea that if anyone has journals or diaries or memorabilia, that kind of thing, artifacts that hail back to this time, and if your ancestors, loved ones may have made that overland trek, please keep it and get in touch with your museums, local, state, national, historians. Those things are invaluable. Don't throw them out. It's not just this old stuff, that grandma and grandpa had. It's just taking up space. No, these are treasures beyond value.
The Oregon-California Trails Association is the nation's largest and most influential organization dedicated to the preservation and protection of overland emigrant trails and the emigrant experience. Our mission at OCTA is to protect the historic emigrant trails legacy by promoting research, education, preservation activities, and public awareness of the trails, and to work with others to promote these causes. Thank you so much for tuning into our podcast. If you're interested in volunteering, becoming a member, or just learning more about the Oregon-California Trails Association, please visit our website at www.octa-trails.org. You can also find us on Facebook and YouTube at Oregon-California Trails Association, and on Twitter and Instagram at @OCTA_1836.